In terms of cult popularity, there's probably never been a video game series that embodies that phenomenon more than the Trails series. You won't see too many big streamers interact with the franchise, nor will you see any of its releases brought up in award shows, but they've got an incredibly devoted fan base that has supported this series through thick and thin. I myself have been a big fan of the series for at least a few years now, and not only has the franchise quickly become one of my favorites, but some of the Trails games have honestly become some of my favorite games of all time. Last year saw the Western release of Trails through Daybreak, and while I did thoroughly enjoy that game, I couldn't say that it didn't have its problems. Just for anyone who's not aware, Trails is a series of incredibly in-depth role-playing games developed and published by Nihon Falcom, one of the oldest JRPG developers to ever do it. It's a subset of another franchise, The Legend of Heroes, and every game with the Trails subtitle takes place in the same setting, telling a connected story that expands with each new entry. There are a lot of reasons to love this series, but I think the most well-known reason is due to its incredible focus on top-tier world building and ever-expanding lore. Yes, it's very hard for newcomers to get into, but for anyone who's braved the journey, it is more than worth it. There's also the fact that, as someone who loves JRPGs, I could just tell that Trails as a series was made for JRPG fans by JRPG fans, especially the early ones. They do a lot to nail that cozy 90s JRPG feel, and I hooked into that vibe almost immediately. Add to that the incredible soundtracks, superb character writing, and outstanding storytelling, and I think me becoming a Trails fan was likely an inevitability. Having said that, it's not like the Trails games are flawless. They do have issues, though for the most part, I've always been able to focus on the positives rather than dwell on the negatives. Unfortunately, it's been a lot harder for me to do that with modern Trails games, and that's not because the games have gotten worse, but because the way the Trails games are being made now is different from how they were being made before. They're a little bit more bloated, and things that used to be good fun feel just a little more tedious than they should be. For a while, I had struggled to figure out exactly what the difference was, but with Daybreak, I think I've figured it out. Now, Trails games do have a tendency to be very long, even in a genre where games are quite long to begin with. They've been even longer recently, what with Cold Steel 3 and 4 both taking me over 90 hours to beat, and that can certainly make a good game feel tiresome. But that shouldn't really be an issue to me. I played Persona 5 Royal multiple times with little issues, and that game runs about 100 hours of playthrough. Same for Dragon Quest XI. That game took 120 hours for me to get through all the content, but I blazed through that with no issues. So I don't think length is the issue when it comes to modern Trails games. What is the issue is pacing. Persona 5 Royal and Dragon Quest XI were long, but they were very well paced, so I never felt like any particular segment was taking too long or overstaying their welcome. It's subjective, of course, but at least when it came to me, I never felt that sense of tedium while playing them. The games were certainly long, but they never felt long. Modern Trails games like Cold Steel 3, Cold Steel 4, and even Daybreak, however, feel very dragged out, even when compared to Trails games only a few hours shorter, like Sky SC and Azure. So what's the difference here? It's important to note here that due to its focus on world building, Trails as a game series is created to be content heavy. It has tons of optional dialogue, optional cutscenes, and optional side quests that all do their part to flesh out the world of Trails. It's the reason why the world building is so in-depth and why so many people love it. It feels like a world that's lived in, and every NPC feels like a character that has their own story, even if they aren't important to the main plot. It's the series' core appeal, and I wouldn't want them to change that for anything. Nowadays, though, it sort of feels like Falcom have gotten into their heads that every Trails game now has to be the biggest, longest experience ever, even when there isn't much cause for it. Now, it's important to understand that Trails is a slow-paced game. The games get to put on their best foot forward when the players don't rush from story beat to story beat, and instead take their time chatting with the NPCs, handling side quests, and generally just enjoying the experience of being inside the game's world. That's the sort of gameplay style Trails encourages. But even when you consider that, it's a fact that earlier Trails games were able to provide all of that in shorter, leaner packages. Were they still long compared to other games? Sure. But the first Trails in the Sky was maybe 45 to 50 hours. Trails from Zero was about the same. Meanwhile, Cold Steel 3, Cold Steel 4, and Daybreak easily double that runtime, without necessarily adding anything noteworthy enough to warrant it. Of course, what really matters is not the runtime, but how you spread out content within that runtime. I'll give you an example. And while it is sort of spoilers for later Daybreak chapters, I'll try to be as vague as I can. In this situation, you're being forced to scour a dungeon in order to stop bombs from being set off in a major city, while also fighting tournament style against other groups trying to do the same thing. The premise clearly builds this whole thing to be an incredibly tense situation where lives are on the line, time is short, and enemies are everywhere. Unfortunately, the game forces this scenario to take place over the course of 3 days, with big breaks in between for more side events and side quests for players to do. This basically cuts off any momentum that's being built, and it's hard to feel any urgency about the whole thing when you're watching the characters strolling around the city without a care and having leisurely talks with people they'll be fighting in the dungeon. You might argue that this is what Trails games have always done, but that's not true. Older Trails games did not push extra side content or side quests where they did not need to be. Sure, maybe there was some extra dialogue here and there, but nothing that would have taken away from the moment for any considerable amount of time. If it was time to focus on the story for an intense scene or an urgent situation, that would be the only thing going on. Even during Azure's finale, a sequence many people unjustly deride as being too long, you're really only given a handful of short kill quests to do during the entire thing, with only 1 or 2 hidden side events here and there. This is because Falcom at the time understood that taking a detour to do a side quest would have killed whatever tension the story was building at that time. In Daybreak, however, every major story beat is broken up by an equally large amount of side events and side quests to check out. When not much is happening and the story isn't necessarily trying to build up some momentum, this is fine. It's just Trails doing what it's always done and fleshing out the world. However, when things are tense and big things are going down, it's sort of weird to keep doing this fleshing out when there's more important things happening. It kills the tension, and while I admit there are plenty of people who would be more than happy to hold up a climax to squeeze out some more lore, I personally would like a little more prudence given to timing. Of course, it's important to remember that a lot of what I'm complaining about is optional. If I really wanted to focus on a story and minimize distractions, I could have just not watched the sub-events or not done the side quests. It's not always possible because sometimes doing the side quests is required to progress, but I could have done that if I wanted a more lean storytelling experience. But this is Trails. Falcom knows that Trails fans are demented lore fiends who gobble up every single bit of optional content they can, especially when so much important world building and lore are hidden behind them. It's weird that they don't consider that when structuring the story's flow. I might sound especially harsh, but I'm only this harsh because I know Falcom is capable of giving us this world building without having to pad and parcel things out like this. I know they have that awareness and sensibility, but they haven't really been bothering with it lately. They're not paying as much attention to the pacing and are just cramming as much stuff into the games as they can and just hope that fans will only focus on that. It's a very clumsy way of doing it, and that clumsiness is only becoming more and more apparent as time goes on. Now, I don't want to make this sound like Trails Through Daybreak is somehow ruined because of this. I don't think that. Daybreak is amazing. It's easily in my top 5 games of the year, and the best Trails game since Azure. But it could have been better. It honestly sucks that I can't call Daybreak my game of the year, because it really had that potential to get there. And if this trend of constantly padding out these games doesn't get better, the harder I think it will be to get back to that golden era. None of this has dampened my excitement for future Trails games. I am still looking forward to Daybreak 2, which is coming out early this year, and the franchise overall still excels at what the Trails series usually provides: strong world building, interesting characters, and unique gameplay. But now there's also a sense of apprehension as well that it's going to have the same flaws that all Trails games have had for a while now, because this is what Falcom has decided Trails games need to be. Some people will eat it up, but I honestly disagree. I don't believe that Trails needs to be super long and full of padded out scenes and dialogue to be great. I don't even need Trails to go back to being 40 to 50 hour experiences. If they can cut the fat and focus on refining the experience that they've been providing for the last 20 years, it will be more than enough. Just my 2 cents. Thanks for watching. I know a lot of people probably don't care about Trails, but I've honestly had this thought in my mind for a while now and just wanted to get it out there somehow. But what do you guys think? Do you think I'm wrong, or that there's some other problem that I'm not discussing? I'd love to hear about it, so please leave a comment if you can. Subscribe if you want to see more videos from me, and I'll see you next time.